Welcome to this panel of Mayor's Reflections on Reconciliation. We are very fortunate to have two amazing panel members who have had in-depth experience as they both led two major cities during times of difficulty and upheaval and worked to lead policies that promoted diversity of voices in their cities. Mayors are at the front lines of culture and character of cities, and I'm confident that our panel can help provide us a historical perspective as well as advice on how we in our respective cities can move forward for a better future. Former Mayor of Denver, Wellington Webb, served as Mayor of Denver for over 12 years during a time of great growth. His bio is also before you, and I recommend it to you. He accomplished amazing things, not only in his election, but certainly in his administration. I know many of you know my friend and colleague, former Mayor Susan Savage, who served our city of Tulsa for over a decade and then served our state as Secretary of State for both of Governor Henry's terms. I thought it was interesting to note as I reflected upon their leadership during their time in office that they had similar priorities. They both worked at increasing the quality of life for all citizens through parks and neighborhood revitalization. And they both also worked to make government services more efficient and more transparent. They both served during the 90s, and they both saw their cities prosper. Both mayors also broke ground in politics in their cities, Mayor Webb being the first African-American mayor in Denver, and Mayor Savage being the first female mayor in Tulsa's history. So to set the stage for this discussion, I'd first like to ask each of our panelists to take us back to that time as they first entered office and to paint a picture for us of what was happening at the national, at the state, and the local level. Mayor Webb, as our guest in our city, will ask you to begin.
Kathy, thank you very much. It's a, I guess I'm going to bring it closer to you, too. First, Kathy, thank you very much. First of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be here in Tulsa. I think the last time I was here was about 12 years ago, and it was at the Greenwood Cultural Center. And I drove by and went over this morning, and it's changed considerably because I didn't know it because the university is all around it at this point in time. And I want to thank Mayor Savage for inviting me out for that particular time frame. I also want to take this opportunity. Some habits are old to break. The sculptor of one of your projects is here in the audience. A good friend of mine, Ed Dwight, who I think is one of the most renowned sculptors in the country. And I'm just pleased to see him and just hope he would raise his hand, and he's a shy guy. I came into office in 1991, and what was going on in Denver at the time, we were in the midst of building an airport. Some of you may have read about it. I had the pleasure of inheriting that project, in which 82% of it was built on my watch, including the infamous baggage system, and as well as we were also going through a time period of dealing with gang violence in the city, and the city was really going through a transformation. One of the first questions I was asked was, what did I want Denver to be? Did I want Denver to be like San Francisco or Chicago or New York or Salt Lake? And I said, I don't want Denver to be any of those. Denver has to develop its own identity, and Denver has to make and create a swagger that people want to be like Denver, and we don't care about what other cities do. We have to define our own destiny. And because too often we would overreact to if there was a column in a New York paper or some other paper that Denver didn't do this, or Denver, you know, if the football team lost, basketball, whatever it was a national catastrophe for people in the city, and I wanted us to get away from that. But I think what's also important is that the main framework of when we came into office, I think, would be the economy, and I think would also be the gang violence that was going on in the city and the airport, and how we address those issues really defined our 12 years as administration, and also helped define me, and also gave a sense of purpose. I'd be remiss if I don't say that No one expected me to win. When the first poll was done, I was at 7% in the polls. My wife never believed the polls because I'd been elected to office as state representative for 7 years. She had been in office for 10 as a state representative, and we were trailing everyone else. And the greatest thing that happened to us was to run out of money. Upon running out of money, we decided to take the campaign to the street. I walked the streets of Denver for the last 42 days and nights, never getting in an automobile. I walked from one end of the city to the other. At the conclusion of that, we walked 365 miles. Everyone could get in something with wheels except me. And so the press coverage dramatically increased as we walked. One, they wanted to walk, they followed us to see if we were going to cheat. They followed us to see if someone that had less money could beat someone that had a lot of money. And thirdly, they wanted to see if this Horatio Alger story could win. And as it turned out, we ended up with 58% of the vote, winning the election overwhelmingly. But it also gave us a real sense of neighborhoods. It gave us a sense of seeing people up close. And so that was kind of the backdrop of coming into office. But I had experience formerly having been in the state legislature, formerly city auditor, and also having worked for the federal government. And I'll close on this and turn it over to Susan, who's a great friend and a great mayor. I have a philosophic view about government in general. I've served in all three of them. I think of the federal government as like the Air Force. It flies high. It passes laws that, in many cases, they have no understanding or implication of what they do to the people on the bottom or on local government. State government, governors are kind of, to me, like the Navy. They're concerned with their territorial boundaries and everything happens within. Mayors are the grunts. They're the soldiers on the ground. They're the ones you see in your drugstore, in your grocery store, you see in your hardware, you see walking, you see more on the lawn. They're the ones that you know their phone number. And if you're in trouble, you normally don't call your congressperson, you call your mayor. And I'll stop with that.
I just want to, before you, I want to say I think your campaign was called the Sneakers Campaign. Is that right? I remember.
And I remember seeing a photograph of Mayor Webb holding those. There's a photograph somewhere of you holding those tried and true and worn out sneakers. I'm so delighted and honored to be here, and I want to also thank my great friend Mayor Webb and my great friend Mayor Taylor for push. Thank you. Pretty essential ingredient. And Julius and the entire board of the center for this opportunity to join you today and have some reflections. I think Wellington and I had the privilege of serving in a very dynamic time through a couple of different transitions, different federal administrations. But I want to give you the backdrop of what was occurring in Tulsa, because there may be people who weren't here at that time, and I came into office under some pretty unusual circumstances as well. Many of you may remember I served with former Mayor Roger Randall, who was elected in 1988 as his chief assistant. It was still the commission form of government at that time. Mayor Randall and the City Commission unanimously passed a resolution to call for a vote on February 14th of 1989 that was entitled "For the Love of Tulsa," to change the form of government to a mayor-council form in light of a federal lawsuit that had been filed by the NAACP and was in federal court. And the prevailing wisdom at that time was, let's take charge of our destiny. Let's not turn it over to the federal courts to dictate how we should structure and govern the citizens of the city. Let's let the citizens decide. And that initiative was passed in excess, I think, with over 70% of the vote in 1989. I had the really great job of leading the transition into bringing together the different organizational elements of the new government. And without getting too much inside baseball, if you remember in the commission form, it was all very vertical. You had a street commissioner and a water commissioner and the mayor and the park, this and this. They were all consolidated under the mayor, and my job became to really look at opportunities for consolidation. And so we went from 23 separate departments to 16 or 17 over the course of a year's time. As the new government went into place in 1990, Mayor Randall was reelected for a 4-year term, and in 1992 he left office midterm to become the president of the University Center at Tulsa, which is now OSU Tulsa, where you were today, Mayor Webb. Under the new form of government, I was the chief of staff and the mayor pro tem, so I succeeded to the position. Well, what no one had ever examined before in Tulsa City Charter was the special election provision. There was no provision for any kind of primary. No incumbent mayor had ever left office as a result of death or stepping down or disgrace or anything. Well, it was a free-for-all. For those of you who remember, what I remember is there were 54 candidates. And there was no filing fee. So at public events, and I think the Tulsa Metropolitan Ministry held one with all the candidates, about 35 people showed up, and it was a little bit like a high school student council race. You've got to stand up and say, I'm running for mayor because I think it's neat. There was not much opportunity to expand upon your qualifications. The media brought it down to the A team and the B team, and there were several members of the city council who were A-team members, myself, and by then Mayor Randall had left, and I was, quote, the interim mayor, so I carried the title of mayor, which running as an incumbent, I will say, does give you some additional strength. So that race was held in August of 1992, and I emerged with 42% of the vote in a field of 54 candidates, and so it was quite a memorable event for those of us who participated. But in looking back over the city, certainly during that period of time and during my tenure, Tulsa was very young in its new government, and there was a lot of optimism. There was a lot of sense of possibilities. The council was defining its role and pushing a little bit at the mayor, but the mayor was the mayor's position. I don't mean to talk about it as if I was detached from it, but as an observer stepping back, you could see that the council was trying to ensure that they had as much of a say in the mechanics and the workings of government on a policy level as did the mayor. There are so many things, and I know we'll get into it, that stand out in my mind, but immediately I was struck by the fact, one of the questions first asked of me in a public meeting was, how does it feel to be Tulsa's first woman mayor? And I said, well, the woman part of that hasn't changed. That's been pretty constant. The operative word here is mayor. How does it feel to be the mayor? And I answered that by saying, not only is it an enormous privilege to serve my hometown, but I feel a tremendous obligation because I viewed myself as a temporary employee, to push the city in ways that we had not pushed ourselves before. And so I set about looking at all of our boards, authorities, and commissions, and I know we made tremendous strides, and Mayor Taylor certainly did as well, in appointing women and minorities. The really important boards were simply not reflective of the population at large. During my tenure, we had a visit from the Ku Klux Klan, and I think we're going to get into some of those sorts of challenges that you experience. But what I remember from that is the headline in the Tulsa World, because Attorney General Drew Edmondson and I co-sponsored a unity rally, and the headline in the Tulsa World was, "Tulsans Choose Unity." There were more people at that than there were with the Ku Klux Klan. We had, certainly during that period of time, the Murrah bombing in Oklahoma City, and our city responded to that. We had 9/11 occur. We had an unprecedented period of growth in infrastructure, jobs, in really getting down to the grassroots of the neighborhoods. And one of the things that I learned from my work prior to entering city government as a community organizer was how important it was, as Mayor Webb has said, to get out in the neighborhoods. So I took walking tours with code enforcement, with the fire marshal, with the police chief to talk about issues within the neighborhoods, with many neighborhoods experiencing problems. And I'll just wrap it up by saying, because I know we're going to get into some specifics, it became very apparent to me, and was certainly my interest, that I was going to accomplish nothing without partnerships that I formed and continued to form with members of the community through civic engagement, with members of the business community, the faith community, and the educational community. We were all intertwined. And I honestly cannot think of a single time when, as the mayor of the city, when faced with a challenge, whether it was the renewal of the third penny sales tax or when the Ku Klux Klan came to Tulsa, that when I didn't go forward and say, we need to think about how we respond to this, that there was not a tremendous response. And I think that speaks well for Tulsa, but it also educated me and made me understand how extremely important it was to have face-to-face, neighborhood-to-neighborhood contact on an ongoing, regular, on-the-ground basis. So I'll stop there.
Well, so what I know, and I've talked to mayors across the country, and I know Mayor Webb, Mayor Savage will agree, is that you wake up every day and you go to the office as mayor and you have a plan about what you're going to accomplish that day. It really never works out that way. And so the next question I have for you is, you all had a lot on your plate coming in that you had to deal with. And looking at it in two different ways, what types of issues of reconciliation did you work a plan to proactively deal with? And then, as Susan has just talked about, what issues of crisis where you had to pull together a community to deal with issues of reconciliation, of societal divide? Tell us about those issues and how you addressed them, what your successes were and what roadblocks you found. Mayor Webb.
During our tenure, I smile because when you talked about how proactively we dealt with some of these, what I thought and felt was always the most difficult were all of the unplanned incidences that you had to deal with. Frankly, managing the city was the easiest. I mean, everybody has to deal with budgets, everybody has to set their own priorities. But it's the unforeseen which takes place that is not scripted. And I'll just share a few of those, and I'll run through them real quick. Amendment 2 was put on the ballot, which was a direct attack on gays and lesbians. English only was put on the ballot, which was a detriment in a fight in which I sided with the Latino community. The Columbine shooting, gang violence between Crips and Bloods, the Columbus Day Parade, which we still deal with every year, between seeing two segments of our communities line up on both sides of the street, which we've still not resolved. And then, Susan, I guess the Klan was they were doing a world tour. Because they also stopped in Denver, and I used to ask myself this question: why me? Why now? They decided to have a rally and a protest on the steps of the state capitol on Martin Luther King's birthday. Now, for those folks from Colorado, they know I introduced the first King holiday bill in Colorado in 1973. Was unsuccessful on 4 attempts trying to get it passed. My wife got it passed after 4 failed attempts. It took our family, since we were the only one carrying it in the legislature, 10 years before it passed. Now I'm elected mayor, which everyone is excited and happy about, and and now we have the Klan on the steps of the Capitol. And I think what Kathy, what I learned is that every value I had was tested in terms of my belief system. So I had students from the Black Student Alliance coming to me saying, do not support allowing the Klan to speak. The governor took a position that he thought it was to be Democratic governor, friend. He filed a brief with this court to deny them the right to speak at the state capitol for fear of injustice. I took a different tack. We filed a brief to allow them to speak. And I told the students that they don't have to go to the state capitol to hear Klan members call them a nigger. That's a personal choice they're making. But if we deny them the opportunity to speak, we're doing the same thing that they would do if they were in charge. And I said, you have to ask yourself the question as to what would Dr. King do? I believe Dr. King would allow them to speak because he believes that right will overcome over evil. So we did have to, we provided police protection for the Klan. And we had a large crowd, two crowds. One turned out to jeer the Klan, another crowd turned out and to have a different march. And that was the only year that they decided to come to Denver. Now we also did something else that I'll share now since I'm old enough and out of office long enough to share it. I also gave a time limit. And I said at a certain point in the day the police would not continue protection. And I noticed their speeches got shorter as the time limit came to about ending, and they saw one of the fences start to collapse, and they headed straight into the Capitol for police protection to be escorted out of the city. The Columbus Day Parade has not been resolved. That's still an issue, and it's a legitimate issue. And we tried conflict resolution between having members of the Italian community and members of the Native American community, primarily American Indian movement, meet. I told both groups, I believe in equal opportunity. Whoever breaks the law, I'll take to jail. And we'll put Indians on one side and we'll put Italians on the other. But we're going to respect the rights of both parties. Now, what I did say to AIM is that they have to change the dynamic of the debate, because it just can't be about what Columbus did as an indigenous explorer years ago. The problem is that Colorado has state law to celebrate Columbus Day. The nation has a law to celebrate Columbus Day. So you just can't automatically repeal Columbus Day because of what the history book says. There's a process by which to do that, and you have to get people on your side. We also went through September 11th. We also went through Denver being called Sanctuary City because I thought our police officers were getting too aggressive with stopping Latino youth and African Americans, but primarily Latino youth. And I called them all in and said, we're not going to automatically stop people just based upon their name ending in a vowel. Denver got a reputation for Sanctuary City, which it still has, which we hold as a badge of honor. So in terms of are there wins and losses, I believe that, like I believe the president also, I believe governors, I believe mayors, and I believe presidents set the moral tone for the city. Cities are a reflection of the people they elect, and the people they elect set the moral tone for the city and how that city or that state go forward. And I think by the decisions we make, if you make decisions based upon the greater good, then you also expand the envelope of bringing people of goodwill together. And we have attempted to live by that. It also has been caused some indigestion. And I'll give you one last example, and I'll stop because I have to catch myself because I'm also Baptist. The last point is, I think if we have these offices, and we too made sure all of the boards and commissions reflected the city, but we also thought that it needed to be a change within how how we distributed contracts. I went through the airport and I found that less than 10% of the concessionaires at Stapleton Airport were women and minority vendors. Most of the vendors were Fortune 500, primarily Marriott Host Aviation Division. So we decided to break it up so that each individual space would be bid on. And then the question is, well, then how do you do that? How do many of the small businesses get capital? So then what we did, we decided to have the banks, since they have to do an RFP to get city banking money, that they would have to be supportive under the Community Reinvestment Act to support the city's principles in terms of minority business and small business and airport business. So that if you were bidding and get a contract at the airport, then you could go to a bank that has city money to get a loan and use the lease from the airport as collateral. What this eventually did was change our ownership of concessions at the airport from less than 10% to 40%, which we're very proud of. It's higher than Atlanta's, which was the highest in the country. But I'll also tell you how life works. We didn't say, so once that happened, then 10 years later what we found out is that many of the individuals, many of those women and minority-owned businesses, after they went in the airport, after about 10 years, they decided they didn't want to stay in the airport business anymore. And they necessarily didn't want to sell their lease space to another minority or woman because they wanted to get the best dollar amount that they could on their investment. And we watched the number drop. And so then the question was, well, can you dictate to them who they're going to provide dollars for? And obviously you can't. But all of this was a learning experience. And I think that you basically, when you come into office, you're a product of your own experiences. And you bring those with you of who you are, how you were raised, and what you were and what you were taught as a kid. And I was born in Chicago. And for anybody that knows anything about Chicago as far as it relates to African American people, if they tell you they're from Chicago, they're really not. Their parents and grandparents are from Mississippi and Alabama because everybody in Chicago is from Mississippi and Alabama. They just happen to be the most recent generation. And so I'm part of that generation that would drive south during the summer where you didn't stop. I was part of that generation. If you were playing sports, I played basketball, you could have 2 start at home, 4 on the road, but never all 5 players. Obviously that's changed, and the world has changed. But it's important to remember the history because my greatest fear are the young people that come up today, come up in an environment that they have very little appreciation for the historical struggle that their grandparents have made in order to allow them to become and have the freedom and agility to go and do what they want, buy where they want, go to school where they want, be employed where they want. They don't see that as much as past generations.
Well said. Thank you. Well said.
In addition to setting the moral tone, I think the mayor, any mayor, has the responsibility to sit and to listen, to really listen, even if it's hard, even if it's unpleasant, even if it's accusatory, even if it gets combative, and then to act. And as I listened to Wellington speak, I was reminded that when I took office, we had a variety of challenges. In 1992, we had our former police chief who resigned. We had a youth ranch scandal. Many of you may remember that. We had a real lack of confidence in the police department. We had the beginnings of a lawsuit from the black officers that grew into a class action lawsuit. Lou Bullock represented the plaintiffs, and ultimately, at the end of my administration, I felt in conversations with him it was very, very important to settle that case, and we worked very hard to get that done. But it was not a settlement that was widely embraced by, certainly by the establishment and by the institutions that were involved in it. But I was often called in, and I want to give 2 or 3 examples because to me they for me, really helped define what I viewed my responsibilities to be. I was names like Derek Gates and Julius Pegues and Eddie Faye Gates and Reverend B.S. Roberts, Reverend George McCutcheon, Ruth Kaiser Nelson. Many of the people in this room sitting here were people, our people, who stood up and said, let me be part of a solution, because the way the city is addressing not just city government, but the way in which our community is addressing this issue needs to be reconsidered, needs to be looked at from a different kind of perspective. A couple of examples. We had, after the Murrah bombing, and I can remember the meeting when Cheryl Siddiqui came to my office, Sandra Rana, I think, was there. There had been a lot of rhetoric at the federal level about this was probably a Muslim terrorist or a Middle Eastern terrorist that undertook the Murrah bombing. So there was at the University of Tulsa a Pakistani man who was very badly beaten, and a lot of fear. And we met with the police chief and with Cheryl's leadership and members of the faith community and began to have a presence at the temple, at the Muslim temple. After 9/11, the Muslim community stepped forward and said, we want to have a blood drive, and will you participate with us? And I was there in both instances, but it took, as I look at that years later, it took not only the willingness of people who potentially were vulnerable in that situation to step up and to say, we want to be part of something better than what has happened, but also for the leadership, myself, the members of the council, the police chief, the other officials, to step forward in a collective way to say our community has to do better. We have a moral obligation because of our history not far from this very location. We have a moral obligation to be better than what our history suggests we were. Appointments of minorities and women were very, very critical from my standpoint because, again, they reflected the community at large and gave greater credibility to the process of government systems. I have maybe a little bit of a different story than Mayor Webb. Many of you may remember when our very enthusiastic firefighters at 36th and Lewis decorated their fire station with a cross one Christmas. And we received a call late in the office that, gosh, there's a cross on the fire station. And I thought, well, no big deal. I'm on my way. I had to go to another meeting. I'll just stop by there. I like the firefighters and just chat with them about, gee, can we turn it into a Christmas tree or something that's pretty ecumenical? Once you begin having uniquely faith-based symbols, then you get into a whole issue of free speech. And it seemed like a pretty benign little problem to me. We had a nice chat, and they understood, and I said, great, I'll see you all later. Well, little did I know that we would have that crazy group from Topeka, you know, that minister who comes in protesting. We had a group from Washington in. The complaint takers at the Mayor's Action Center got the most incredibly hateful calls. And I stood for, and I was attacked by many members of the religious community, but more importantly, I was supported by members of the religious community who said, no, this is the right thing to do. But it was, as Wellington has so eloquently described, it was one of those circumstances where you know for the larger issue of freedom of speech and the right that every citizen has to feel as if its government reflects them, not just one particular faith, that you have to do something for which ultimately you get beaten up pretty badly. I look at that, I look back on that because there were aspects of it that were, to me, so you sort of laugh because it's like, you're kidding me. But it became a rallying cry for many members who wanted to use religion as a wedge issue in a community. And that's what I see happening in the political world, and that's where I think mayors and other elected officials have to be willing to represent a moral compass that is reflective of the views and reflective of the tone within the community. And I'll stop there.
I think it's very. It's interesting to hear both of you speak about how you tackled both the very emotional issues and the very pragmatic issues like minority representation in contracts. And so I'm going to take it. I'm going to take off on that and say, as we approach the November elections, a historic time, the first time our first African American president faces re-election. And there's a lot of rhetoric in the community about expectations. So what I wonder is, as you all face those issues, how did the barriers that you broke, gender and race, impact your ability to govern a diverse community, your difficulty in making and getting consensus around decisions that may have been, for example, with the Ku Klux Klan, different than the expectations of many who supported your election? That's the politics of reconciliation.
Well, it made some love me more and made some hate me more. It depended on which side of the fence that you were sitting on. I mean, with the King decision supporting the Klan's ability to speak, being a former Black Studies instructor at the University of Colorado, it certainly didn't sit well with some of the students. But what I shared with them, you have to see the larger picture. You have to see the larger picture and not just the battle. And sometimes, again, this goes back to what your own experiences are. I think that when we look at these issues of tolerance and communication, it's about how you share with those individuals that maybe you don't have as much contact with and try to bring them into the circle. Because what I have also found is that when people are frightened, they'll give away every right they have without regard. When we went through a summer of gang violence and the tipping point was Crips and Bloods were driving down a very busy street, which would be similar to Main Street in Tulsa, and they fired, one car was firing at the other car, and the bullet strayed and hit a pole and hit a 6-month-old baby in the zoo. The child didn't die because the bullet hit a pole first. I had the most liberal parts of the, we'll say, ACLU community come in to see me about doing something about gang violence and saying, if I have to pick up every Black kid that's associated with a gang, a Hispanic kid, picking them up and they'll support me. I said, well, first of all, it's not illegal to belong to a gang. It's like an association. But we are going to have town hall meetings about the gang violence throughout the city. And I'm also going to have the gangs participate. Now, their difficulty is they're going to have choose one spokesman, which caused a really rift among them, trying to choose one person. But everyone has to have the opportunity to speak so that everyone is operating on the same ground rules. Because I think the ability to communicate and everyone understand what the ground rules are very important. And then the police have to know that as well. And I found what I found surprisingly shocking where these were people I knew, and their opinion was the hell right now with the Bill of Rights. We can't be in our front yard for fear someone's going to come down the street and fire. We now are being relegated to being in the back of our house or in the backyard, which was how bad it was. And at that time, the press didn't help because they were promoting gangs by putting when kids were getting arrested, they'd put their gang names in the paper. They were putting, which we then got them to stop doing. They were putting witnesses' names in the paper, which we then got them to stop doing. A lot of real negative things. But I guess if there's a moral to it, is this job, as both of these outstanding mayors know, it also helps you redefine what your belief system is and what you really believe in. So, when September 11th came, then we started reaching out to the Muslim community to demonstrate that this was an act that wasn't across the board. We brought people from the mosque and Catholics and all the religious community together to say that we're one city. And we did the same thing with Columbine. Columbine wasn't in Denver, but because it was unincorporated, many of the police officers at Columbine were Denver officers. And then we had a prayer vigil that afternoon, and the message was, hold your child, because you never know how long you're going to have them with you. And so I think it also allows you to deal with what devices you have in terms of being pragmatic, but from my point of view, maintaining the vision of the city that it's a community of itself, and it has to revolve around itself, and it has to protect itself, and it has to share the same values. And you have to continue to restate what those values are through your actions, and not through your rhetoric.
One of, following Columbine, so I want to sort of build upon Wellington's theme a little bit. Following Columbine, the police chief and I decided, along with many members of the community, that we would host a Mother's March Against Guns. I think it was the only one in Oklahoma, maybe the only one in this part of the country. And we had one of the Columbine parents come speak because we were having similar problems in our community with violence, gun violence. And what was stunning to me, and of course we now have an open carry law that's going into effect where you can carry an unless this business prohibited it, you could carry your weapon in here if you chose to do so. And I don't have a problem with guns, but I have a huge problem with gun violence. And just in the last week, looking at the Tulsa papers, the little boy from Emerson who was shot just at random, the young woman, I believe, from Memorial High School who had an incredible future ahead of her, who was shot and killed. Circumstances of that aren't known. You have to stand up and say, at some point, we have to draw attention to the fact that these issues are about life and death and about quality of life. I move on to the political. That was pretty political. I mean, the NRA. I probably could not get elected dog catcher as a result of that, but. I actually was a member of the NRA as a kid, but that's a different story. One of the other things that I found pretty interesting when you get into talking about business was when we revamped the entire capital improvement process, the planning process of the city of Tulsa. It had been handled through the Planning Commission and through a very technical way, and I asked neighborhoods to get involved with it and held public hearings on different kinds of projects and brought in a variety of different points of view. And when we began to make selections for projects for what would be included in any funding package, whether it was a third penny sales tax or a bond issue, the people you have to turn to support those kinds of public improvement initiatives are the contractors. And so there was a little bit of a disconnect if we were trying to break up projects to make them more accessible to those who normally or otherwise wouldn't get work, and to build them in areas of the city where those areas there had been a poor allocation of resources previously. There was a lot of give and take, and there were some pretty political aspects to that as well. But again, we pushed at it because if you have good facts, and if you use those facts, and if you make a decision based on those facts, you usually can withstand the heat. During during Wellington's time in office, you may remember that the contract with America was passed at the federal level, Newt Gingrich's contract with America. And here in Tulsa, I began to see that filter down in the tone that was taken as some of the deliberations at the City Council. A lot of impact on the community development block grant funding, a lot of issues around social welfare programs, and whether or not the city should be funding those. Those discussions continue today. We're seeing those probably with greater intensity than we ever have. But that's when I began to see the partisanship enter into our local politics, and the overlay of an ideology that drove policy decisions more so than they had, certainly from my experience. One of the great opportunities we had in which Dr. John Hope Franklin was able to participate was Tulsa Centennial. And that, if you were here at the time, it really brought the community together for the course of a year with great events celebrating our centennial. We had the tribes involved because the Creek Nation, of course, Tulsa was an early settlement of the Muskogee Creek Nation. We had the faith community involved. We had the education community. We did neighborhood projects. There was something almost every day of that year. Many of the events were government sponsored, not government paid for, but they were City of Tulsa sponsored. Many of them were just neighborhoods celebrating some unique element of their history. So the community was able to come together around that in a way that fostered a sense of pride, and that was a very good time in our city, I think, because we were able to accomplish a lot, and people looked at less about the politics of the issue and more to what Tulsa's future might hold. I'll stop there.
I think that's it's great to hear both of you say and not focus on either gender or race, but instead focus on the values that you helped your communities set as a way to bring their direction forward. And I think a mark of a great leader is taking the blame when something goes wrong and sharing the credit when something goes right. And if you'll notice in the dialogue with both Susan and Wellington, they have referred to we, and they have referred to others in the community who helped them guide the city. They have decades of experience, so I'd like them now to address what they think should be next in the dialogue for cities across the country, and what roles can each of us play to move the dialogue in our communities forward.
I think it takes place on 2 or 3 levels. The first, let me say that, and I never thought it at the time, I think that the high school I attended probably did more for me in terms of allowing me the ability to achieve success in later life because of the integration of the school I attended. The makeup of Manual High School in Denver at the time I attended was 1/3 African American, 1/3 Hispanic, and the other third was a mixture between Japanese and white. So coming out of that experience, I never felt uncomfortable in any setting, anywhere in the country that I went into. Our high school was elected from that student body, 4 mayors and 4 mayors, Norm Rice in Seattle, Washington, Patsy Jo Hilliard in East Point, Georgia, Wellington Webb in Denver, and now Michael Hancock in Denver. We all attended the same high school. Three of us all had the same social studies teacher who never gave an A. And she was still correcting me even after I became mayor in terms of my grammar. But so I think the integrated education or shared experience among young people is vitally important, where people have an opportunity to learn and understand each other at an early age. I think all of us have a responsibility to teach civility, respect for each other. I think that even though, as I look back on it, I have reprimanded myself for things I've said about the previous president and his grammar and his ability. But I think that what we have seen as it relates to our present president in non-respect for the office, in non-respect for the man that has the office, regardless of what you feel about his principles, not only makes us as a nation look bad, it makes us as a country look bad. It says we don't respect ourselves. And I think that all of us can be change agents. All of us can be teachers. All of us can be change agents, and we don't have to run for elected office to do that. But we have to be consistent in our own belief system and our values. My values come from primarily 6 sources. My father, who never graduated from high school. My mother, who was a housewife, and my grandmother, who graduated from Dillard back in the 20s, and my grandfather, who graduated from Tuskegee, and Nelson Mandela, who I have always admired for his ability to be strong about his dedication to the freedom of people for South Africa, and also his belief on reconciliation afterwards. I think for people that listen to him and talk to him about how he harbors no grudge after spending the amount of time he spent in prison is unbelievable. The last one is that when I was teaching, I always used one of my textbooks. Happened to be some Dr. Franklin from Tulsa, a great historian who comes out of the Carter G. Woodson school of thought. In order to really understand a history, it has to be written, where people can see it and read it and not forget about the points that were left out. I think that is I think that is very important. I think it's going to be also very critical as the election comes up. And I think the same thing holds true for Governor Romney as well. I think that those individuals that want to attack him based on his religion, we have to stand up for that as well. You can attack his policies, but I don't think you can attack his faith and attack his person. And I think the same thing has to hold true. We have to have the same level playing field where we all play by the same set of rules.
I think there's some dynamics that exist today that certainly were not present when I was in office here in Tulsa. The proliferation of technology and its use in our daily lives is, I had a cell phone the size of a lunchbox, and I had a little bit of email that the Tulsa World, tried to capture all my emails at one point. It was great fun because I didn't really even know how to use it very well. But so the impact of technology, we can have an issue develop in a community, on a federal level, internationally, in which everyone's involved. Look at the Arab uprising and the amount of interest in that and the sense of connection people had. So technology can be a tremendous tool for us to think about how we manage life in our communities and how we talk to one another. It can also, you can be sitting in the next room emailing someone, so you have to learn how to use it. I think we all talk about the global awareness that continues to bring us closer together, but our economic systems, and we know this as mayors, our economic systems are inextricably linked, not only to other communities, but throughout the world. And so might be a workforce development issue here in our city or in our state is also one that is occurring every place else across the country. Issues of very, very difficult issues of how we live together, and I think it's the Oklahoma Conference for Community and Justice. I always remember a poster that said, learning to live together is the last great lesson. And as we talk about reconciliation moving forward, we also have to talk about how we live together as people of different faiths, of different colors, of different heritage, and get to know what that means. We have some institutional memory in this city, some great families. Maxine Zero sits here representing, the Zero family, who have long been incredible benefactors to this community, and more importantly, incredible citizens. We have Ruth Kaiser Nelson, I mentioned earlier. We have John Franklin and Dr. John Hope Franklin, who is an iconic figure. Each one of these individuals and the people they represent history of this community, and we cannot possibly understand how to interact with each other if we don't understand our own history, whether it is as a community or as a state. Now, the way in which Oklahoma was even formed, our Indian nations here, our tribal governments were forced here. This is not where most of them wanted to be. They were forced out of their homelands. That creates a dynamic that we have to understand in order to be able to respond in a way that is productive as we move forward. I can't agree more with the issue of civility, and I will tell you that while I served as Secretary of State following President Obama's election, I periodically would get calls into the office, and when they came, I had them directed to me, asking me why I didn't do something about the President's birth certificate. And if it was a particularly tough day with the legislature in session or something and I was really grumpy, I would engage. And I would engage by saying, well, why are you calling the Oklahoma Secretary of State about this issue? Well, because you Secretaries of State, you talk to each other, and you could do something about it here. And I remember saying to one woman, why don't you do something productive with your time, like volunteer at the animal shelter, or do something, because this is not a productive use of anyone's time, especially mine. And she said, I'm going to call your boss. And I said, would you like his number? And, that was that. But the civility and the manner in which we talk about, and it's become easier through technology. And certainly, I think, as we are more global in every aspect of our lives, and Tulsa has done a wonderful job in becoming a very international city through sister city programs, through the Tulsa Global Alliance, through educational initiatives. But we have to develop, I think, not only an understanding of other cultures, but of customs and languages and their history and politics.
It again is generational. My grandson is one of the young, handsome ex-football players, and I asked him one day. He said they were giving a party, and I was really kind of silly, and I was wondering, did they have an invitation? He laughed, and he said, "That's old school stuff." He said, "We just text," and I said, "Well, how many people are you gonna have there?" He said, "I don't know. This is Friday, probably 500, probably 600 tomorrow." I didn't believe him, and so I said, well, you can take Pops out there with you. And so I went out there. There's 600 kids out there. Integrated. Black, white, brown. He said, well, we know how to come together for a social activity. And we do this all the time. NBA does it. Football teams do it. Getting them to focus in on something that's intellectual is a whole different capacity that requires a different dialogue, but you have to sit down and talk to them. And I think that the issue of enthusiasm for the second term, for anyone that was elected the first, it's historical that there's a slippage the second time, because history's been made, and it's happened in every election. But there are new people coming in that are registered. I told a young friend of mine that's got elected not long ago. He's 41, and he's talking about he's a new generation. I told him my grandson and others are 20, and they're right behind him. So he can't rest on his laurels, because each generation looks at the one in front of it as the older. And so I think what we have to do is really have a dialogue with young people in terms of how we get them involved and how we pass the torch and how we give them responsibility and also the luxury to not be perfect, the luxury to make mistakes as we did. In many cases, and I've done this because I've switched from starting running a lot of different campaigns for young people, the biggest impediment are older people. We tell them to get involved, and then we block them when they try to get involved. We have to give them opportunity. And we have to also, and the other piece I think is important is I believe that the arts also are an indicator of where certain segments of the population are, either through poetry, writing, and music. And those issues have to be addressed as well, because that's what people listen to. I talked to Russell Simmons. He's telling me, they've got more white kids now around the world that are dressing black than they have black kids that have adopted the culture. And so you have to address it by through the mediums that they use and utilize. And a lot of that is, as Susan said, it's through technology. My youngest grandkids, I think their kids are going to be deformed because they're going to all have these big thumbs from, they're always on, that's all they do all day long. And so I think we just have to talk to them more and talk to them less and listen to them more.
I had the privilege this last semester at the University of Oklahoma, the College of International Studies. I was asked to establish an international leadership program, and I was able, through an application process, to select the students who would participate. And working with these 12 to 15 kids throughout the semester, they don't see any obstacles. They don't see color. They don't see gender. They don't see faith. They don't see sexual orientation. Those aren't barriers to them. Access to jobs, a stable economic system here in this country and the world, how they compete for limited jobs. Those are the barriers they see, and they really want to learn from older people like me, and I certainly was one of the oldest people they had encountered in a while. But what they don't have the patience for is people who tell them you can't do it because. They don't have any patience for that. So I think, to Wellington's point, that we need to listen, but we also have to create. It goes back to tone. It goes back to not even an opportunity, but to give them a sense that whatever we did, they can do, and they will probably do it better. There's a young representative in the state legislature. She's just been there, I think, coming to the end of her second term. Her name is Emily Virgin. She's a law student at OU. She's 24, 25 years old. Just decided to run. I mean, Norman's a fairly progressive, politically progressive town, and she just decided to run for the legislature for an open seat in the House. She has taken on some pretty tough issues and has her own little cult following of students at the University of Oklahoma in the political science department and the law school. But the other side of that, she understands that her life is not defined by her tenure in the legislature. It's an opportunity to serve. It's not an opportunity to guarantee re-election. And so I think her perspective is right. or for me, it's right. And not only is she courageous in the kinds of issues that she will undertake, whether they be, and they all revolve around trying to ensure that basic human rights are protected, whether they're for women or whether they're for people of faith. But she's articulate and she's educated and she wants to serve. And I think she's very representative of many of the people in our colleges and universities. And so we have to really take them seriously. They're smart, they're capable, and creating avenues for them to succeed, I think, is part of our responsibility as that generation that had, I had so many people ahead of me who paved and traveled paths that were very, very difficult for them as women. And it made it easier for me. And that's how I see my obligation.
Kathy, I need to do two things real quick before I get in trouble with my publisher. I do have a book out, so you can look on Amazon.com, and it's called Wellington Webb, the Mayor.
I should have mentioned that.
That's all right. My publisher's going to be mad because I didn't bring any books in. But the second part is that one of the students that read the autobiography came and met with me, and he was more important with, so all African Americans in the room know you can do the swab test and then determine kind of what tribe, which part of Africa you're from, and he noticed that he said, well, you're from the Cameroons, from this particular tribe, and tracing your DNA. And I was struck by the fact, he said, I was surprised how much in your book was colored by race. And Susan, really kind of speaks to what you were saying, because this generation does not see life the way we see it. And it really took me back for a minute, because the book is about my generation and what I went through getting from A to Z. They have no concept of that at all. It's an entirely different generation, and we have to talk to them in a different term. And it is about, for them, jobs and opportunities, and they're smart, and they have access to technology that we never thought about. The other piece, though, I do worry about that generation, is their compassion and care for the less fortunate and for those that are shifted off to the side, and who also takes care of that group as well, so that they don't get shoved aside in society and then become a permanent underclass that has to be dealt with in different kinds of ways.
Thank you. And I do commend and recommend his book to you. It is a good example of seeing exactly what they've been talking about today, and that is the impact a mayor can make on not just the economics, but truly the values of a community. We do have time for a question and actually an answer period as well, even though we have all politicians on the stage. We will have both questions and answers. So if anyone has any questions, we have 2 mics. Please feel free to come forward. And Susan and Wellington will answer all the questions.
You too, Kathy.
I'm interested about a couple of political issues and how you as mayors would view it. One of the things that's taking place across the country, particularly in the municipal elections, is making them non-partisan. Would both of you comment on that? And the other issue is also about the electoral process, the election process. And that is the voter ID that is being passed in many of our states. And we see an issue right now in the state of Florida to disenfranchise people.
You want to go first?
Yeah. I was elected and ran each of my 3 elections on a partisan basis, and I know Tulsa has just amended its city charter for nonpartisan races, and I support that. I mean, I live in Oklahoma City at the moment and have for the last 8.5, 9 years. They run on a nonpartisan basis, but everybody knows who everybody is, and it's sort of the only thing it precludes, if you say we're nonpartisan, is simply to list your party affiliation on the ballot, because you still have robocalls coming from the same political figures who represent whatever the party is of the person who's running. So I'm not sure it makes a huge amount of difference in the final analysis, but it seems to make people feel like they feel maybe a little bit better about taking hard lines on partisan-driven issues. I was not a supporter of voter ID. I voted against it as a constitutional amendment. I think as a Secretary of State, the Election Board was under my purview as a cabinet agency, and I believed that a lot of the rhetoric around voter ID really had to do with driving voter turnout in a particular election. We've not had voter fraud. In fact, Oklahoma's voting system has been one of the model voting systems that's been used across the country. So voter fraud really was not an issue. And I think voter ID, there still are people alive who don't have driver's licenses, who don't have qualified certain kinds of identification that will make it more difficult, will disenfranchise them. They might be intimidated even going to the polls thinking that their identification is insufficient. And so I think it's very problematic for us in the short term. I'm not sure about in the long term how that will change. I will tell you, and I will add this as a caveat, you didn't ask it, watch the initiative petition process and the legislative referendum process in our state. There has been, over the last 8 years, two things that I saw as Secretary of State. One is every initiative petition drive during the period of time, or let me say that different, with two exceptions. The initiative petition drives that were not launched by people based in Oklahoma. They were launched by outside political interests who paid signature gatherers to come into the state to drive public policy decisions here at the state. Tabor was an example.
Right.
And that was overthrown. The Protestants did an incredible job of identifying the problems in that petition. The second process that you need to pay attention to, all of us do, is the legislative referendum process. And what you find is, often with the legislature these days, if a bill can't get passed through the legislature, it will circle back as a referendum to be placed on the ballot to amend the Constitution so that the people have a right to say. And I think what it does over the long term is pretty much render the legislature moot. I mean, why do we need them if all they're going to do is ask us how we want to vote? But many of those questions, voter ID was one of them, State Question 744 about banning or defining marriage between a man and a woman. I think we have an affirmative action question that will be on the ballot. Those are all designed to drive voter turnout, and it works because so few people vote. In a presidential election, we will have a greater voter turnout. But for the most part, we don't vote. If you look at school board elections, if you look at city council races, people simply don't vote. And it allows the minority to drive the majority in many cases. So I would encourage you to look at that issue as well.
We have nonpartisan elections. City's 67% Democratic. So whether we say we're nonpartisan, I mean, everyone knows what candidate belongs to what party. But I think it does take the air of partisan politics out. We like to say parks and clean air, and that's nonpartisan stuff. So, yeah. The second issue, we know that there's an attempt to have voter suppression for this election. And all these wedge issues are going to be placed on the ballot primarily to turn out specific voter interests to unseat President Obama. Plain and simple. That's the purpose. That's the goal. And Americans are smart people. We just have to be smart enough to tell others this has nothing to do with what you think it is. This suppression across the country is to limit votes that might be going towards Barack Obama.
I like to just add one point. I have one of my favorite photographs is of my very elderly grandmother not long before her death, and has a Savage for Mayor button that she's wearing, and she was in her early 20s before she got the right to vote as a woman. Yet she lived to see one of her granddaughters elected as Tulsa's first woman mayor. Presumably she voted for me. I never asked her, but
You bet she
but
did.
it was. So I look at that and I'm reminded of the fact that we have to do everything we can to preserve and protect this right of expression, and part of it is using it. We have to exercise it and make it work for us.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that is another role that each of us can play, is to make sure that we do what we can to encourage voter turnout. And I do agree with Susan and Wellington on this issue of voter ID. As if someone feels somewhat disenfranchised, if we make it more difficult for them to express their right to vote, we are only over time going to see, I think, less and less participation in our form of government, and I think to not a good end. So I will tell you that whenever I give a speech to young people, I tell them that on their 18th birthday, they should do 3 things. They should first get up and have a healthy breakfast, because after all, I'm a mother. And then they should call a friend who is 18, who is not yet registered to vote, and the 2 of them should go down and register to vote, and then make sure that every election, whether it is a municipal electric franchise where less than 2,000 people in the city of Tulsa voted recently for that, in that election, it is a city council or it's a school board, they need to understand the history that people fought for that right, and they should exercise it every time they can, and they should exercise it with great knowledge and diligence. So are there any other questions? Very good.
I don't know, is this on?
You might
No.
have to be loud.
Okay, cool. So I'm from that younger generation that you were talking about. And I just want to push back a little bit on the idea that we, as young people, don't experience race or class or gender or sexual orientation as barriers or obstacles. We do experience them as huge barriers and huge obstacles, particularly as they interact with our ability to pursue jobs or other opportunities. There's a huge power structure there that has everything to do with where we lie in those categories. And I'm sure that since both of you have broken those barriers, that you've experienced discrimination and certainly those power structures. And in the vein of addressing our history and talking about these issues, learning this language, I was wondering, since we are this wicked smart generation, if there's anything that from your experience that you would want to share politically with my generation about overcoming those obstacles.
Sure. And thank you for that point, because I was trying to make the point. I think among yourselves you don't see race, but without question, once you get into the bigger world, because it's full of old people and baby boomers like me or other people who I mean, clearly we have issues in our community, our nation. Well, you may, but that's what I meant, and so the clarification is useful, and it's always difficult to generalize. So thank you for that. In terms of political wisdom, wow. You get into war stories, and I don't want to do that to anyone, because so many of them are funny now as you look at them, and they seem kind of strange too, to think that a woman elected to office by the city, and Kathy and I have had these conversations in the past, would be taken any less seriously than would be a man, but that was the case occasionally. And so I found for me personally, treating such situations, depending upon what the dynamic was, with a little bit of humor.
Yeah.
Diffusing it to the extent I could, being better prepared than anyone else in the room, and being unequivocal in my desire to find an outcome to whatever the point of discussion was. I do think sometimes we can get wrapped up in the seriousness of, I am woman, hear me roar. And trust me, I came out of college. I mean, the stuff that was going on in the legislature and in Congress this year about women's reproductive rights, I was having a mind warp thinking, I thought we settled this stuff. But that aside, it took me a long time to learn in a setting what you're really trying to get to is the goal. What is the goal? And if you're clear about the goal, then at no time should you settle for a lack of civility or disrespectful behavior. But you can diffuse it often in different ways. And trying to lighten the air a little bit was useful for me.
Let me say that if I hope we didn't paint the picture that you were going through utopia, because that certainly was not the goal. And certainly your generation, as others have, barriers to overcome, as do all of us. I know my wife says she agreed with Shirley Chisholm's book, being an African-American female that was elected. She said she thought that getting hit with sexism and racism simultaneously was even more difficult, and sometimes the sexism was worse, even from her own peers, the males in her own ethnic group. I think the whole issues of what goes on with Latinos in our country, and especially what's going on in terms of the non-acceptance in many cases within the GLBT community is significant in terms of being denied opportunities, in terms of employment, in terms of housing and public accommodation, some of these other issues. But if you fight on the same format for equal rights for everybody, then it doesn't. Then whichever group it is, you're still fighting the same battle. Whether it's for men or whether it's for women, for me, the consistency has to be there. And I think if you're consistent in with your values and your beliefs, it makes it easier also for whatever role you're going to play in politics. I think the other piece is integrity. I think it's very important that if you give your word, you keep it. Number two, if you don't say anything you don't want to see repeated, and of course don't write it down. I think that I think work ethic, I've often said a lot of the people that ended up working for me, some of them I took out of campaigns because they were bright and they worked hard. They did it for free. And I figured if they did it for free, they'd do it even better if they worked for me. The other, Kathy, and this is I learned this during my first term. I hired a lot of smart people because I had so many to choose from. The second term, about 35% were replaced because all smart people don't share your values. If I'm fighting for affirmative action for artists or for contracts at the airport and I've got people dragging their feet and, they're magna cum laude academically, but in terms of their value system is different from mine, I made some poor choices because I was looking at only their technical competence and their academic competence as opposed to looking in addition to their belief system. And then the last thing I'll share with you is what my grandmother taught me. And she said, if you make a speech, and she was a dressmaker, because she couldn't get a job as a teacher after graduating from Dillard. She said, when you do a speech, make it long enough to cover the subject and short enough to be interesting.
Thank you for that advice. And we received some good advice from a participant earlier as well that I'll share with you, and that is, if you see an injustice, even if it doesn't impact you personally, stand up against that injustice, and that will make a difference. Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing their wisdom. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you.